This story is titled, I secretly discovered that our unexpected family gathering was actually a carefully orchestrated plan so relatives could compete for my wealthy grandmother's attention. But her fortune went to her most devoted caregiver. Me, not them. Hey Reddit, my name is Thomas, and I'm 29 years old. Every year, my family holds this massive reunion at my grandmother's mansion. It's always a full weekend event filled with barbecues, bonfires, and endless conversations about everyone's life updates. I never really questioned it much. It was just something we did, a tradition that existed since before I was born. My grandmother is basically the glue of our family. She's super wealthy and strong-willed as hell. Her approval carries serious weight in our family dynamic. Everyone listens when she speaks, and when she gives advice, people treat it like law. She's the matriarch in every sense of the word, and her influence extends into every corner of our family's affairs. This year, I arrived early to help set up. My Aunt Bethany asked me to grab some decorations from Uncle Robert's study. I went in expecting to find party supplies, but instead discovered a stack of index cards on his desk. At first, I didn't think much of them, but then I noticed the labels. Each card had a family member's name followed by rankings and short notes. Some of the notes were straightforward, like most financially improved or most likely to succeed. Others were weird as hell, with comments like biggest disappointment and worst life choices. The handwriting was definitely my uncle's. I stood there flipping through the cards, trying to process what I was looking at, when my cousin Oliver walked in. Oliver is 32, a bit older than me, and had already been hitting the bourbon pretty hard, judging by the slight sway in his step. He took one look at the cards in my hand and started laughing. Not nervously, but more like he found it hilarious that I was just now figuring this out. "You didn't know," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Dude, this whole thing is a competition. According to Oliver, these reunions aren't just about catching up with family. They're an unspoken contest where everyone is trying to impress my grandmother, whether they admit it or not. She's known to reward whoever she deems worthy with business investments, financial gifts, and even property, all handed out under the guise of generosity. Oliver made it clear these gifts aren't random. They go to the ones who performed the best during the reunion. Looking back, it made too much sense. I'd always noticed how certain relatives thrived right after these reunions. New businesses, new homes, sudden promotions. I thought it was just luck or coincidence, but now I wasn't so sure. The family had always been successful, but I never realized how strategic some of them were about flaunting their achievements. The pieces were starting to fit together in my mind, forming a picture I wasn't sure I wanted to see. That night at dinner, I started paying attention in a way I never had before. Every conversation revolved around success. My cousin Victoria, who had just landed a high-paying job at a corporate law firm, made sure to bring it up multiple times during the evening. Uncle Robert subtly mentioned his latest investment whenever the conversation allowed for it. Even my younger cousins still in college talked about their internships and future business plans with a rehearsed enthusiasm that now seemed suspicious. It wasn't normal small talk. It was calculated as fuck. Each achievement was presented like a submission for judgment, with my grandmother as the sole evaluator. The casual mentions of success, the strategic timing of these announcements, it all played into this bizarre competition I had somehow missed for years. Then there were my parents. They've always stayed neutral in family matters, not the type to boast or compete openly for attention. But now I wondered if that was intentional. Had they known about this all along? Had they deliberately stayed out of it? Their quiet demeanor at the table suddenly felt like its own strategy rather than simple modesty. At some point in the evening, I overheard Uncle Robert and Aunt Bethany whispering in the hallway. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but their conversation caught my attention as I was passing by to refill my drink. "I think we have a good shot this year," my uncle said in a hushed tone. She was really impressed with Daniel's promotion. His wife nodded in agreement. "Yeah, but did you hear what Christopher said? He's trying to get in on that new tech startup. That might sway her." That's when it really hit me. This wasn't just a casual game. People were strategizing, keeping track of who was doing well, who was falling behind, and who had the best chance of gaining my grandmother's favor. The index cards suddenly made a lot more sense. They weren't just notes, they were fucking scorecards. And this had been going on for years. The more I thought about it, the more things started clicking into place. My grandmother never outright announces these rewards. She just decides, and everyone accepts it. No one talks about it directly, but they all play along. And now that I knew, I couldn't unsee it. The strangest part was realizing how naturally it all flowed. No one ever makes it obvious, well, except maybe Victoria with her repetitive law firm mentions. Yet the entire evening felt like a presentation. Everyone was showcasing their accomplishments, subtly and sometimes not so subtly proving their worth to the family matriarch. And my grandmother, she sat at the head of the table, listening, nodding occasionally, asking questions, judging quietly but unmistakably. Her piercing eyes would linger a moment longer when someone mentioned a particularly impressive achievement. She'd lean forward slightly during discussions of financial success, as if mentally taking notes. It was all so subtle that I'd never noticed it before, but now her evaluating presence was painfully obvious. That night, lying in bed, I replayed every past reunion in my head. The patterns had always been there. I just hadn't noticed. The cousin who got a business loan right after impressing everyone with his business plan at the reunion 3 years ago. The aunt who received help with her mortgage after showcasing her community volunteer work. The distant relative who suddenly had connections to elite universities when his son was applying to colleges. But now I had a decision to make. Did I want to play along? Did I want to join this unspoken competition and start angling for my grandmother's approval? Or did I want to call it out for what it was? A manipulative power game that turned family relationships into transactions. One thing was certain. This year, I wasn't just here for the reunion. I was here to figure out the truth about my family and what it meant for my place within it. The morning after my discovery, I started looking deeper. I couldn't ignore what I'd learned. It had completely changed how I viewed my family. I went back through my memories and checked up on various family members, particularly those who had mysteriously gotten ahead right after past reunions. The pattern was clearer than ever. It was never the quiet, unassuming relatives who received my grandmother's generosity. It was always the ones who played the game, those who made sure to highlight their successes, strategically praised my grandmother, and subtly downplayed anyone else's achievements. The correlation was impossible to miss now that I was looking for it. One of my aunts, Jessica, was setting up for breakfast when I entered the kitchen. She's always been a little on the outside of family politics and has a reputation for gossip, so I wasn't surprised when she leaned in toward me while arranging pastries on a platter, lowering her voice to ensure no one else could hear. "This has been going on for decades," she told me, her eyes darting around to make sure we weren't overheard. "Your grandmother has a system, a ranking of sorts, where she determines who is most worthy. According to Aunt Jessica, my grandmother rewards those who impress her, but not just with money. Sometimes it's connections, land, even stock tips that somehow always pay off. What makes it worse is that there's no way to tell who's winning until the reunion is over. No one is ever told outright. Things just happen later, favors materialize, opportunities arise. In the afternoon, I was helping arrange the dining area for lunch. My grandmother's study is always locked, but as I passed by with armfuls of table linens, I noticed the door was left slightly ajar. I stepped inside, meaning to grab a serving tray from one of the shelves, when I spotted an old leather-bound notebook sitting open on the desk. It wasn't just any notebook. Inside were detailed notes, written in my grandmother's precise handwriting, assessing nearly every family member. I quickly scanned the pages, my heart racing at what I was seeing. There were names, achievements, and predictions about each person's future. Some notes were brutally honest. One of my uncles had poor decision-making skills and was deemed unlikely to recover from his financial mistakes. A cousin was noted as a hard worker but too passive, with additional comments about needing more ambition. And then there was me. Under my name, my grandmother had written that I have potential but lack ambition, and that I'm comfortable but not striving. Reading those words felt like a punch to the gut. It was clear that just existing wasn't enough in her eyes. Only proving yourself through success and calculated moves earned her approval. I shut the notebook and put it back exactly how I found it, but my mind was racing. Every decision she made about who to reward wasn't based on kindness or familial love. It was a calculated assessment of who provided the most value to her vision of success. There was nothing random about it. My grandmother had been keeping score all along. That night at dinner, I decided to test something. When the conversation turned to careers, I mentioned a recent work project I was proud of. It had gone well, but it was nothing groundbreaking, just solid work I had put effort into. My grandmother gave me a polite nod and immediately moved on to ask my cousin about his international business dealings. That's it. No follow-up questions, no interest in the details of my accomplishment. It confirmed what I suspected. Small achievements didn't matter in this household. She only cared about major wins, the kind that could be showcased and admired by others, the kind that reflected well on the family name. Meanwhile, the overachievers knew exactly what they were doing. My cousin Philip kept bringing up his startup, emphasizing growth numbers that seemed to get more impressive with each mention. Another relative casually dropped a mention of a business deal they landed overseas, as if it were an afterthought rather than the carefully placed brag it clearly was. And every single one of them made sure to sprinkle an admiration for my grandmother's wisdom and influence. "I never would have thought of that approach if not for your advice last year, grandmother," one would say. "Your insight into market trends has always been uncanny," another would add with practiced sincerity. It was a strategy. Praise her, showcase success, and downplay anyone who wasn't doing the same. The shift was so clear when someone made a mistake during the conversation. One of my uncles, probably a little too relaxed after a few drinks, mentioned an investment that hadn't gone as planned. The air at the table shifted instantly. My grandmother's expression turned neutral, almost blank, and the conversation steered away from him immediately, as if by collective instinct. It was as if he had quietly eliminated himself from the running with that single admission of failure. And it wasn't just the usual competitors who were playing harder this year. My own brother Marcus, who never cared much for these things, suddenly started talking about his stock portfolio and future business ventures with an enthusiasm that seemed forced. He wasn't just making conversation, he was competing, and the realization made my stomach turn. That's when I understood the divide in my family. There were two distinct groups: the ones who play the game and benefit, and the ones who ignore it and get nothing. The line was clear now, and almost everyone had chosen their side long ago. At one point during the night, my cousin Nathan leaned in while we were grabbing drinks at the makeshift bar in the corner of the living room. The rest of the family was engaged in their usual performance of success stories across the room, giving us a rare moment of privacy. "You know," he said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper, "if we faked a success story, made it seem like we had landed some huge business deal, we could probably manipulate grandmother into rewarding us." He wasn't entirely serious, his slight smirk giving away the half-joking nature of his suggestion, but the fact that he even thought that way said everything about how our family operated. This wasn't about honesty or real achievement, it was about performance. The suggestion lingered in my mind, highlighting just how twisted this whole system had become. But what really shocked me was watching my parents that evening. My father, who usually keeps conversations simple and avoids talking about work at family gatherings, started mentioning his career milestones as if trying to remind everyone that he had been successful throughout his life. My mother brought up their home renovations, listing expensive upgrades in a way that felt deliberate and calculated rather than conversational. It wasn't like them at all. They had never played into this before, at least not that I had noticed. Had they always been part of it, just more subtly than the others? Or were they feeling the pressure this year for some reason? Either way, watching them participate in the competition made everything feel worse somehow. At one point I made a joke, something about how I should fake an engagement just to impress my grandmother. It was meant to be lighthearted, a way to process the absurdity of what I was witnessing. But the second the words left my mouth, I felt her gaze on me, sharp and unreadable. If there was ever a moment to confirm that she didn't appreciate humor about this unspoken system, that was it. The brief flash of disapproval in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. Then, right before dinner ended, my grandmother made an announcement that sent a ripple of tension through the room. She would be meeting with select family members the next morning to discuss their future. No further details, no explanation of who would be included, but I knew what it meant. This was the final step. This is where the real decisions were made about who had successfully earned her favor this year. I watched as subtle glances were exchanged around the table. Some relatives looked confident, others nervous. My brother Marcus caught my eye and gave a small, smug smile. He thought he was in. I caught my mother touching my father's arm gently, a silent communication passing between them. Now I had to figure out what to do. Play along or expose it. Either choice had consequences I wasn't sure I was ready for. If I played along, I'd be validating this toxic system and becoming part of it. If I exposed it, I risked being ostracized by the family I'd grown up with. There didn't seem to be a middle ground. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. Most of the family had gathered outside for brunch on the expansive patio overlooking my grandmother's meticulously maintained gardens. I stayed back, waiting in my guest room, pretending to take a work call. I had a feeling about what was coming next. Just as I suspected, after about an hour, one of the staff, Maria, who had worked for my grandmother for as long as I could remember, came looking for me. My presence was requested in my grandmother's study. My heart pounded as I followed Maria down the long hallway, the plush carpet muffling our footsteps. When I stepped inside, my grandmother was already seated behind her large oak desk. A steaming cup of tea sat beside her, untouched. The room smelled of old books and leather, the kind of space designed to make you feel small the moment you enter it. Sunlight filtered through heavy curtains, casting the room in a dim, serious light that matched the occasion. She gestured for me to sit across from her, flipping through a folder as if she had been preparing for this conversation for a long time. Perhaps she had. The silence stretched between us as she reviewed whatever notes she had compiled, letting the tension build deliberately. Finally, she looked up at me, her expression carefully neutral. "Thomas," she began, her voice steady and measured, "I've been watching you. I see potential in you, but I'm unsure if you have the ambition to truly make something of yourself." Then she got to the point. She was willing to invest in my future, but only under certain conditions. I waited, knowing there had to be a catch. And there was. She had a plan in mind for me, a specific career path that she believed would elevate my position in the family. According to her, my current job as a marketing consultant wasn't enough. If I wanted her backing, I had to pivot, leave my job, and pursue something that aligned with the family's image. She had already picked a role for me, something connected to a family business where she had influence. She assured me it was a guaranteed path to success, that I wouldn't have to struggle the way some people do. But it wasn't just an offer. It was an unspoken ultimatum. If I refused, there would be no second chances, no future opportunities, no quiet last-minute gestures of financial help. I would be out. As I sat there processing what she was saying, the door opened. My older brother Marcus walked in, grinning, looking more excited than I'd ever seen him. He had just finished his meeting with our grandmother and had accepted her offer without hesitation. She was investing in his company, ensuring that he had the funding and connections needed to succeed. He stood next to her, nodding as if to reinforce that this was the right decision, the only decision. His presence felt deliberately timed, a living example of what cooperation with her plans looked like. His future was secured. Mine hung in the balance. When I didn't respond right away, she didn't push. She simply closed the folder in front of her and told me to think about it carefully. Then, just like that, I was dismissed, the meeting over before I had even formulated a response. Outside, the family was still gathered for brunch, but the atmosphere felt different now. Some people were laughing and talking as usual, but I noticed certain relatives watching me closely as I emerged from the house. Those who hadn't been called in for a private meeting had a different energy about them. Subdued, almost resigned. It confirmed what I already suspected. Being chosen meant something, and being ignored, that meant something too. As I walked through the crowd, Aunt Jessica caught my arm, her fingers digging in with surprising strength. She pulled me aside, away from the others, toward a quiet corner of the garden where we wouldn't be overheard. "Be careful," she said in a hushed voice. "Accepting your grandmother's offer isn't just about money. It comes with obligations, unspoken rules that once agreed to can't be broken. According to her, those who accept aren't just receiving help. They're being bound to the family in a way that means they can never fully step away." My aunt's eyes darted nervously as she spoke, checking to make sure no one had noticed our conversation. Her warning carried the weight of personal experience, though she didn't elaborate on what her own history with my grandmother's system might be. At lunch, I noticed my parents watching me from across the table. They had always remained neutral in family dynamics, at least outwardly, but for the first time, they weren't even pretending. My father casually brought up my grandmother's generosity, mentioning how she had helped others succeed over the years. My mother, who had never pushed me about career choices before, suddenly seemed invested in what I was planning to do next, asking pointed questions about my long-term vision. Then something I didn't expect happened. Cousin Nathan, who had joked with me the night before about faking a success story, was now giving me cold looks whenever our eyes met. He had been one of the people passed over for a meeting. I had seen him watching the house all morning, waiting for a summons that never came. And now, instead of camaraderie, I saw something else in his expression: resentment. I wasn't just another family member anymore. I was competition. Throughout the day, I paid closer attention to the ones who had been chosen in previous years. They weren't just successful. They were deeply embedded in the family structure. They attended every gathering, every event, no matter how minor. They spoke about my grandmother's influence with reverence bordering on worship. They weren't just relatives, they were part of a structured system, and they never strayed too far from it. The realization hit harder as the afternoon went on. If I accepted my grandmother's offer, I wouldn't just be taking money or guidance. I would be committing to this system permanently. My achievements wouldn't just be mine. They would be part of the family's legacy, my grandmother's influence. And if I ever wanted to make a different choice later, that wouldn't be an option. I'd be trapped in the role she had selected for me. At dinner that evening, the air was heavier than usual. The decision was mine to make, but it felt like the whole family was waiting for an answer. I noticed my grandmother watching me from her place at the head of the table, not with impatience, but with certainty. She already knew that most people, when given this kind of opportunity, wouldn't walk away. The financial security alone would be enough to convince most, let alone the status that came with her approval. As I sat there surrounded by people who had played the game and won, my brother with his new investment, my uncles with their successful businesses, my cousins with their perfect careers, I realized something fundamental about this whole situation. This wasn't just about ambition or financial stability. This was about control. My grandmother didn't just want to help family members succeed. She wanted to determine what success looked like for each of us. Now I had to decide, accept the investment and submit to the system, or walk away and risk being cast out forever. The decision had already been made in my mind, but I wasn't going to walk away quietly. During dinner, with everyone gathered around the long dining table, I decided to challenge my grandmother directly. The conversations were flowing as always, relatives subtly weaving their achievements into the discussion while my grandmother nodded along as she took mental notes. This time, I wasn't going to sit there and pretend I didn't know what was happening. I leaned forward, speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear. Is that what these reunions are? Just a disguised competition? A way for family members to prove their worth for financial rewards? The room went silent instantly. Forks scraped against plates as they were slowly set down. Glasses were placed on the table with careful precision, but no one spoke. The tension was palpable, like a physical presence pressing down on all of us. My grandmother didn't look surprised by my question. She took her time, sipping from her glass before finally responding, her voice calm and measured. "Life is a competition, Thomas," she stated plainly, as if explaining something obvious to a child. According to her, success isn't something that should be handed out equally. It should go to those who deserve it, those who have the ambition to claim it. She said it as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. I turned to my parents, expecting some kind of reaction, some sign of support or at least acknowledgement, but they stayed quiet. My mother looked down at her plate, avoiding eye contact. My father stared ahead, his expression unreadable. Their silence told me everything I needed to know. They knew. They had always known. I wasn't done. I pointed out how some relatives struggle, scraping by while others mysteriously receive financial boosts, business investments, houses, even luxury vacations, all because they played along with the competition. It wasn't just about merit. It was about obedience, about proving loyalty to her. That's when the backlash began. My older brother Marcus, who had happily accepted her deal just that morning, scoffed and called me entitled. He said our grandmother owed us nothing, and that if she wanted to reward people who actually work for success, that was her choice. It wasn't unfair, it was just reality. Then my Aunt Jessica, the same one who had eagerly whispered to me about the ranking system the night before and warned me about the strings attached to any deal, suddenly changed her tune. She turned to me, shaking her head in disapproval. "You're being ungrateful," she said, with unexpected harshness. "If you had the chance to secure your future, why are you making such a scene? This is how things work. And if you don't like it, maybe you don't belong here." The rest of the table reacted in different ways. Some nodded in agreement with my brother. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the confrontation, but unwilling to speak up. A few cousins seemed like they wanted to say something, but held back. No one wanted to go against my grandmother. No one except me. My grandmother let the arguing go on for a moment, observing the chaos she had cultivated with a detached interest. Then she spoke again, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade, silencing everyone immediately. The choice, she explained, was simple. Accept her offer or be cut off completely. She wasn't going to force me, but she also wasn't going to waste her time on me if I didn't want to be part of the family system. I didn't hesitate. "No," I said firmly, meeting her gaze directly. "I reject your offer." She gave the smallest nod, then continued eating as if nothing had happened. To To her, I was already irrelevant. A piece removed from the board, no longer worthy of consideration. The shift in the room was immediate and jarring. Conversations moved on without me, flowing around me like water around a stone. I could feel it happening in real time. Relatives stopped making eye contact. Some turned their backs slightly when I tried to speak. I'd been cut out socially before I'd even left the table. After dinner, my older brother Marcus smirked as he passed me in the hallway, muttering something under his breath about how I'd just thrown away an opportunity most people would kill for. My younger cousins, the ones who used to look up to me during these reunions, suddenly kept their distance, as if my dissent might be contagious. I'd gone from being part of the family to an outsider in a matter of minutes. Later that night, one of my uncles, my father's brother, pulled me aside in the kitchen where I'd gone to escape the tension in the main room. He lowered his voice, glancing over his shoulder to ensure we weren't overheard. "There's still time to fix this," he said urgently. "If you apologize, smooth things over. Maybe your grandmother would reconsider." His concern seemed genuine, but I noticed how his eyes darted nervously toward the door, afraid of being seen showing sympathy to the family pariah. I didn't answer. I already knew what my decision was, and no amount of pressure would change it. As I passed the study on my way upstairs to my room, I overheard my grandmother speaking with one of my aunts. The door was slightly ajar, and their voices carried clearly into the hallway. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even disappointed. She was dismissive. "He made his choice," she said simply, her tone matter of fact. "He is no longer my concern." Hearing it said out loud made it real. I was out, completely severed from the family's inner circle and all the benefits that came with it. The finality of those words hit me harder than I expected. When I finally saw my parents alone, catching them in a quiet moment on the veranda where they'd retreated with their after-dinner drinks, I hoped for some sign of support, some indication that they understood my position. Instead, my mother let out a tired sigh, smoothing her dress absently as she avoided my eyes. "I wish you had just gone along with it," she said softly. My father simply looked at me, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "You should have played along," he said flatly. That was it. No argument, no attempt to defend me or understand my perspective. They'd chosen their side, and it wasn't mine. At that moment, I knew there was no going back. If this was how my family operated, if loyalty to a toxic system was more important than actual family bonds, then I was done protecting their secrets. No more silence, no more playing along. If they wanted me out, I'd make sure everyone knew exactly what they'd turned their backs on. The next morning, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Conversations were quieter. The usual morning chatter felt forced and artificial. Eyes subtly avoided me as I walked into the dining area, where most of the family had gathered for breakfast. I'd already been pushed to the sidelines, but I wasn't done yet. I sat down with my younger cousins, the ones still in high school or just starting college. They were eating and joking around, completely unaware of the power plays happening around them. I leaned in casually, pretending to join their conversation about school. "Have you ever wondered," I asked, keeping my tone light, "why certain relatives mysteriously got houses or new businesses while others seem to struggle all the time?" The table fell silent. Before they could answer, I continued, pointing out how their parents weren't just here to reconnect with family. They were competing for inheritance, for investments, for approval from the family matriarch. I laid it all out plainly, watching their expressions change as the reality of our family dynamics sank in. The reaction was immediate. Confused expressions, disbelief, a few awkward laughs as if waiting for me to say I was joking. But I wasn't. I watched realization set in, the way they glanced at each other, as if trying to make sense of all the subtle family dynamics they had grown up around, but never fully understood until now. Across the room, my grandmother noticed what was happening. She stood up, her posture straightening imperceptibly as she commanded the room with her presence. With a controlled voice, she called for everyone's attention, and in a single measured sentence, she shut down the conversation. "Thomas is causing unnecessary conflict," she announced, her voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "And breakfast is not the time for ridiculous accusations." Her tone left no room for argument. But the damage was done. The younger cousins weren't laughing anymore. Some looked toward their parents as if expecting an explanation for what I'd just revealed. A few relatives exchanged tense glances, realizing I'd just dragged a long-buried secret into the light where it couldn't be ignored. By the afternoon, an emergency family meeting was called. Everyone was gathered in the sitting room, the energy charged and defensive. My grandmother sat in her usual place, an antique armchair that might as well have been a throne, with my parents nearby. My brother Marcus was looking smug from across the room, positioned strategically at my grandmother's right side as if to emphasize his new status as the chosen one. The meeting wasn't a discussion, it was an ambush. I was immediately confronted for stirring the pot and disrespecting the family by making accusations that painted them in a bad light. The hypocrisy was staggering, but not unexpected. My parents didn't defend me. My father sat stiffly, arms crossed over his chest, while my mother simply looked exhausted, her eyes fixed on the pattern of the oriental rug beneath our feet. Their silence was deafening. My brother Marcus, of course, took the opportunity to remind everyone that he had accepted their grandmother's guidance without issue. "Some of us understand how to show gratitude," he said pointedly, looking at me like I was a fool for not doing the same. The implication was clear. I was the problem, not the system. Some of my aunts and uncles lashed out, calling me ungrateful and disruptive. A few cousins stayed silent, avoiding eye contact with anyone, clearly wanting to be anywhere but in that room. The family was closing ranks, just as I had expected they would. But I wasn't backing down. I pointed out the hypocrisy of it all. How could they claim to value family when their relationships revolved around competition? How was this about deserving anything when the winners were just the ones willing to perform the best for my grandmother's attention? That's when something unexpected happened. An aunt, Catherine, who had always been on the quieter side and never one to make waves, suddenly snapped. Something broke in her at that moment, and she couldn't hold back any longer. "I played the game because I had no other choice," she admitted, her voice shaking with emotion. "Being ignored meant struggling while watching others succeed. Do you think I enjoyed it? Pretending to be someone I'm not just to get my share?" Her outburst surprised everyone, including herself, judging by the way her hand flew to her mouth as if trying to push the words back in. Her confession set something off in the room. A fight broke out between relatives. Accusations and resentments that had been simmering beneath the surface for years suddenly exploded into the open. Some defended the system, claiming it was fair and based on merit. Others finally admitted it was a twisted power game that had damaged relationships beyond repair. "She's been playing us against each other for decades!" one cousin shouted, pointing at my grandmother. "She's rewarded us for our hard work. That's not manipulation, it's recognition," another fired back. Through it all, my grandmother sat quietly watching, observing the chaos with the detached interest of someone watching pieces move on a chessboard. When the shouting finally died down, she spoke, her tone sharp and controlled. She announced that from now on, all financial support would be private. There would be no more visible signs of favoritism, no more public rewards. And most importantly, anyone causing drama like this in the future would be excluded from any considerations. Then she turned to me and made it official. Since I had chosen to opt out, I would receive nothing. Not now, not ever. That was it. No anger, no argument, just a cold, final decision delivered with the certainty of someone who knew her word was law. The meeting was over. After everyone filtered out in tense silence, two of my cousins, Emma and Daniel, pulled me aside in the hallway. They admitted in hushed voices that they hated the system too, but they were afraid. Afraid of losing financial security, of being blacklisted like I'd just been. They admired what I'd done, they said, but they wouldn't risk doing the same. Their futures depended too much on staying in my grandmother's good graces. My brother Marcus, still reveling in his victory, made sure to get one last jab in before I could retreat to my room. He cornered me on the staircase, blocking my path with a smirk plastered across his face. "You've lost," he told me, his voice low but triumphant. "You'll regret this. You've walked away from a future most people would kill for, and for what? Some misguided principle?" He shook his head in mock pity. "You always were the foolish one." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say that would penetrate his certainty, his belief that he had won. In his mind, securing my grandmother's favor was the ultimate victory. He couldn't see the cage he'd willingly stepped into. That night, I overheard my parents talking in their room as I passed by in the hallway. The door was slightly ajar and their voices carried more than they probably realized. "I hope he knows what he's doing," my mother said, sounding disappointed and worried. "He's going to struggle now." My father simply replied, "He's made his choice," in a tone that suggested the matter was closed. Neither of them tried to change my mind. Neither of them told me they supported me. They had cast their lot with the winning side, and I was now officially on the outside. The next morning, I packed my bags early. I wasn't going to stay another second in that house, surrounded by people who saw me as nothing more than a failed player in their game. As I walked out, no one stopped me. A few relatives watched from windows, but no one came to say goodbye, and my grandmother. She didn't acknowledge me at all. I passed her in the foyer as she was speaking with one of the staff, and she looked right through me as if I weren't even there. For the first time in my life, I was completely severed from my family. When I got back home, it didn't take long to realize how deep the backlash ran. The family group chats that were always active suddenly went quiet whenever I spoke. Messages that would normally get immediate responses were met with silence or one-word replies. A few relatives who would normally send casual messages stopped responding entirely. It wasn't just a cold shoulder, it was a coordinated shutout. Then the rumors started. A cousin, one of the few who still spoke to me, reached out hesitantly to let me know what was being said behind my back. According to some family members, I had disrespected my grandmother in front of everyone, throwing a tantrum when I wasn't chosen for the inheritance. The story had been completely twisted into something else entirely, painting me as jealous and entitled, rather than someone who stood up against a manipulative system. My older brother Marcus made sure to take full advantage of the narrative shift. He went around telling people that I had lashed out because I was jealous of his success, that I couldn't handle the fact that I wasn't seen as worthy. He painted himself as the mature one, the grateful grandson who had embraced our grandmother's guidance, while I had supposedly made a scene because I couldn't accept the reality of my own shortcomings. Through all of this, my parents remained silent. They didn't defend me, didn't correct the rumors, didn't acknowledge the way my brother was actively smearing me to solidify his position. Their silence was louder than any words could have been, a clear statement about where their loyalties lay. A distant Uncle Richard, one who had never been particularly close to me but had always been fair, reached out privately through email rather than the family channels. He wrote that he respected what I'd done, but he wanted to make sure I understood something. I'd burned a bridge that could never be rebuilt. People who go against my grandmother don't get second chances. He didn't say it with malice, just as a fact, a warning about the permanence of my decision. Then came the power move that made everything even more official. My grandmother made a very public donation to my brother's business, a significant sum that practically guaranteed its success for the next several years. It was announced in the local business journal, complete with a photo of her and Marcus shaking hands in front of the company logo. It wasn't just financial support. It was a message to the rest of the family that loyalty has its rewards and disloyalty has consequences. And just when I thought the situation couldn't spread further, it did. At work, a distant cousin who happens to be in the same industry subtly hinted at knowing about my fallout with the family. While I was surprised that the gossip had reached that far, I realized it was more likely just internal family gossip reaching extended circles rather than a deliberate campaign to ruin my reputation. Still, it was unsettling to know that they weren't just shutting me out socially, but they were trying to make sure I couldn't escape the consequences, even in my professional life. Then the social media weirdness began. Relatives who never interacted with me before suddenly started watching my Instagram stories. No likes, no comments, just watching. Others, including people I had no direct conflict with, quietly unfollowed me. The digital ostracism was subtle but unmistakable. And then came the final move. One of my closest cousins, Ethan, who I'd grown up with and considered more of a brother than a cousin, blocked me entirely. I later found out through a mutual friend that they'd been told to pick a side. The message was clear. I was officially out. A few days later, the final confirmation arrived in my email inbox. I was formally uninvited from the next family gathering, the first time in my life that I wouldn't be at the annual reunion. There was no explanation provided, just a terse note from my aunt, who organized the event saying my name had been removed from the guest list. The silence around the decision was deafening. Meanwhile, my brother was celebrating. He threw a lavish party at his newly expanded office space, openly marking the occasion of my grandmother's investment in his business. Everyone was there, all the aunts and uncles, the cousins who had sided with him, even my parents. They weren't just present, they were part of it, smiling in the photos that circulated afterward, raising glasses and toasts to his success. That's the part that stung the most. My parents attending that party was their way of showing where they stood. They hadn't defended me. They hadn't even remained neutral. They had fully stepped over to the other side, embracing the system I had rejected. But then something unexpected happened. One of my younger cousins, Zoe, who was just starting college, reached out through a private message that she made clear she didn't want anyone else to know about. She wasn't ready to openly side with me, but she wanted me to know that not everyone agreed with how things had played out. Quietly, more people were starting to question the system, she said. The cracks were small, but they were there. I could have spent my energy trying to prove I wasn't the villain of the story. I could have fought back against the rumors, tried to regain my family's approval, attempted to work my way back into the fold. But what would have been the point? The moment I refused to play their game, I had already lost in their eyes. So instead, I decided to focus on my own future, on building something that had nothing to do with them. I put all my energy into my career, into forming relationships outside the toxic family bubble I'd grown up in. I let go of the need for their approval or understanding, and over the next few months, cracks started showing in the perfect facade. My brother's business, initially bolstered by my grandmother's investment, hit rough patches due to market downturns and internal mismanagement. His once flawless reputation in the family took a hit, though no one said it outright yet. The same family members who had praised him, who had called me foolish for rejecting the money, were now whispering about his missteps. I watched from a distance, detached from it all. Whether they admitted it or not, they were finally seeing what I had seen all along, that my grandmother's approval couldn't protect you from reality, that her money couldn't guarantee success if the foundation wasn't solid. A few weeks passed before I got the first call from a family member who had previously cut me off. It was from my cousin Alexander, who had fully embraced the competition, one of the loudest voices defending my grandmother's system during that final confrontation. The moment I answered, his voice was sharp and frustrated, lacking the smug confidence I'd come to associate with him. Their promised financial support had been delayed, he told me. Money they were counting on, money my grandmother had seemingly guaranteed, hadn't materialized on schedule. He wasn't just venting, he was panicked. He had already made commitments based on that promised investment, and now he was caught in a precarious position. I think she's reevaluating her choices, he admitted, his voice lower now, as if he was afraid of being overheard even though he was calling me from his car. She's reconsidering who is actually worthy. I didn't say much, just listened as he unloaded his frustrations and fears. The cracks in the system were showing, and he was feeling the first tremors of what happens when you build your life around someone else's conditional approval. Then, during a family dinner when I obviously wasn't invited to, things apparently boiled over. Later, a different cousin, Maya, who had been one of the few to maintain occasional contact with me, filled me in on what happened. My older brother Marcus and an uncle got into a full-blown argument over who deserved more of my grandmother's investments. It wasn't subtle or behind closed doors. It was public, loud, and embarrassing for everyone present. According to Maya, plates scraped against the table as voices rose. Family members were whispering to each other while trying not to get caught in the crossfire. And my grandmother sat at the head of the table, watching it all unfold with that same impassive expression she always wore during moments of family discord. And then came the real hit to the family's perfect image. My brother's business, the one that had been funded by my grandmother as her grand display of favoritism, suffered a major financial loss. It wasn't just a minor setback or a temporary cash flow issue. It was the kind of loss that didn't just sting but left him in serious debt. Poor management decisions, a bad investment that went south, whatever it was, it had backfired spectacularly. The golden grandson was suddenly looking a lot less golden. The fallout spread fast through the family network. Some relatives started whispering, questioning whether my grandmother's system was really as foolproof as she had always claimed. If my brother, the one she had personally backed and publicly endorsed, had failed so dramatically, then maybe this whole ranking system wasn't as flawless as she wanted everyone to believe. Then, unexpectedly, Uncle Richard, the same one who had warned me about burning bridges, reached out to me again. He had stayed silent through all of this drama, never picking a side openly. But now, in a private conversation over coffee at a place far from any family haunts, he admitted something surprising. "I've always hated the ranking system," he confessed, stirring his coffee absently. "Always resented it. But I've been too financially dependent to speak out." His voice was tired, worn down by years of playing a role he despised. "I admire what you did," he told me, almost bitterly. "But not everyone can afford to walk away. Some of us are trapped." His words stayed with me long after our meeting. The idea that many in the family might feel the same way, but couldn't risk their security to stand against it. They were hostages to financial dependence, playing roles they hated to maintain access to resources they needed. And as if things weren't already bad enough within the family, paranoia started spreading like wildfire. Some relatives became suspicious of each other, questioning who was still fully committed to the game and who might be working against them behind the scenes. The once hidden competition had turned into an open battle, with accusations flying at family gatherings and in group messages. People who had spent years manipulating their way into favor were now accusing each other of doing the same, unable to see the irony in their outrage. Alliances formed and dissolved within days. Trust, already in short supply, evaporated completely. Then my brother Marcus made his biggest mistake yet. In a desperate attempt to salvage his reputation after his business failure, he tried to shift the blame onto our cousin Christopher, claiming he had given him bad financial advice on purpose to sabotage him. It was a transparent attempt to redirect my grandmother's disappointment, but it backfired spectacularly. Christopher, furious at being made a scapegoat, didn't hold back. He shot back with accusations of his own, calling Marcus out for his arrogance, his blind trust in their grandmother's money, and most of all, his willingness to throw anyone under the bus to save himself. The confrontation happened at a smaller family gathering, but the fallout was nuclear. Other relatives got involved, sides were taken, and the family group chat exploded into chaos. Long-buried grievances suddenly surfaced as people used the opportunity to air all their resentments. Years of forced politeness gave way to raw honesty, and it wasn't pretty. For the first time since all of this started, my father called me. His voice was quieter than usual, lacking the certainty I had always associated with him. He admitted that he had never liked the way the family operated, that he had felt trapped in it too, financially reliant to ever speak out. But he had known for years that it was a toxic system. He just hadn't been willing to lose his place in it. "I should have stood with you," he said finally, the words clearly difficult for him to say. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was the closest thing to acknowledgement I had received from either of my parents. The fights within the family didn't stop. The group chat turned into a war zone, with arguments spiraling out of control on a daily basis. Accusations of greed, disloyalty, and manipulation flew back and forth. Cousins who had once strategized together now barely spoke. Aunts and uncles who had once prided themselves on family loyalty were openly turning against each other. And through all of it, my grandmother stayed silent. She didn't step in to stop the fighting. She didn't attempt to restore order. She just let it happen, watching as the family tore itself apart from a distance, never intervening even as things got worse. Then came the final blow that shattered the illusion of security everyone had been clinging to. One of my cousins sent me a message, short but direct, forwarding an email that had been sent to the family. My grandmother had temporarily paused all financial gifts. No more investments, no more quiet handouts, no more safety nets. Panic spread through the family like wildfire. Some members tried to pretend it didn't affect them, maintaining a facade of independence and financial stability. But others were clearly struggling with the sudden removal of the safety net they had come to rely on. Some had made big purchases expecting support that now wasn't coming. Others had business plans that hinged on investments that were now frozen indefinitely. The reality of just how dependent many of them had become on my grandmother's financial gifts was finally sinking in. The system that had seemed so beneficial to those on the inside was revealing its true nature, a trap disguised as opportunity. And then my mother called. Her voice was careful, hesitant, as if she was choosing each word with extreme caution. She admitted she regretted letting wealth dictate relationships within our family. She regretted the way things had played out between us. But even now, she wasn't willing to stand against her mother. She wasn't ready to fully break away. She still wanted to believe there was a way to fix this, to restore the family to what it had been before, or at least the idealized version of it she clung to. Then, something happened that had never happened before in my lifetime. The annual holiday gathering, the one family tradition that had always been untouchable, happening without fail every December 23rd for as long as anyone could remember, was abruptly canceled. No explanation was provided, just a short email from the usual organizer saying it wouldn't be happening this year. I didn't respond right away when I received the forwarded message from my cousin. I sat with it, staring at the screen of my phone, realizing what it meant. The family had spent years pretending everything was fine, years holding these reunions as if the competition was just a normal part of life. But now the facade was crumbling, and they couldn't even maintain the pretense of being a functional family unit. I watched from a distance as the empire my grandmother had built on control and favoritism slowly collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. And for the first time since walking away, I felt truly free. Free from the anxiety of measuring up, free from the constant evaluation, free from the toxic competition that had defined my family for generations. Days passed without much thought of my family until I got a message from an aunt I had barely spoken to in months. She said my grandmother had asked about me, curious if I had come to my senses yet. I ignored it, knowing full well it wasn't genuine concern, but another calculated move to pull me back into the fold now that things were falling apart. Just when I had adjusted to the silence, to my new life outside the family bubble, I got an unexpected call from a number I immediately recognized, despite not having it saved in my contacts anymore. It was my grandmother herself. I answered out of shock more than anything else, my curiosity overriding my better judgment. Her voice was calm, controlled, just as it always had been. But there was something off about it, a tension underneath the practiced smoothness. She wasn't calling to ask how I was doing. There was no pretense of warmth or reconciliation. She got to the point immediately. The competition, the family ranking, the silent battles for inheritance. It had never been about fairness, she admitted without hesitation. It had been a test, a way to see who could handle pressure, who had the ambition and cunning to thrive in a cutthroat world. She had expected the competition to turn family members against each other. That was the goal all along. She wanted to see who would rise above the others, who would break under the weight of it all. Watching it unfold, watching people fight, betray, and manipulate each other. It wasn't just part of the process. It was the process itself. The way she spoke wasn't casual or conversational. It was deliberate, as if she was finally revealing the rulebook to a game I had refused to play. She had spent years carefully setting up the family dynamics like a chessboard, waiting to see who would play her game the best. She truly believed that money and power revealed a person's true nature. In her eyes, the way people fought for her approval proved who was deserving and who was weak, who had the fortitude to succeed in life and who would always struggle. I stayed silent, letting her speak, letting her unravel her own twisted philosophy without interruption. Then, just when I thought the conversation couldn't get worse, she made an offer that took me by surprise. Despite everything, she still saw potential in me, she claimed. If I wanted, I could still win the game. I could still prove myself worthy of her favor. And if I did, the reward wouldn't just be financial favors or temporary gifts. It would be everything. Through an uncle who still occasionally reached out, I had heard that my grandmother had been reconsidering her will recently. While her call didn't directly mention inheritance, the implication was clear. There was still a way back in, but only if I conformed to her expectations, only if I acknowledged her authority and played by her rules. I recognized it immediately for what it was. Another tactic, another manipulation, another way to pull me back under her control. It was the same method she had used on everyone else, dangling just enough power and wealth in front of them to make them forget they were being controlled, to make them willing participants in their own subjugation. I let her words sit in the air for a moment, considering how to respond. Then I told her clearly and firmly that I wanted no part of it, no part of her game, no part of her so-called legacy. And before she could twist my words, before she could throw out another baited statement designed to hook me back in, I hung up. Almost instantly, my phone lit up with calls and messages. My older brother Marcus, aunts I hadn't spoken to in months, a cousin who had barely acknowledged my existence since I left. I didn't even have to answer to know what was happening. She had already spun the story in her favor. By the time I had even processed the conversation, she had gone to work, telling the rest of the family that I had disrespected her again, that I had thrown away a generous opportunity out of arrogance and spite. The smear campaign intensified overnight. More relatives unfollowed me on social media. A few sent passive-aggressive messages questioning my judgment, and some openly accused me of trying to destroy the family's traditions out of jealousy. The same people who had spent years competing, lying, and backstabbing each other were suddenly united in one thing: hating me, the person who had dared to walk away from it all. But then something unexpected happened. One of my cousins, Rachel, someone who had been deep in the competition, who had altered her entire career path to please my grandmother, reached out to me through a private message. Her text was short, rushed, but filled with a desperation that came through even in the written words. "I feel trapped," she confessed. "I've played the game because I thought I had to. I don't know how to leave it without losing everything." The message ended abruptly, as if she was afraid of saying too much, or perhaps had been interrupted while writing it. I stared at my phone for a long time, unsure how to respond to this sudden crack in the united front. And then another surprise came just days later. The aunt who had first spilled the truth to me Jessica, the one who had always hovered at the edges of the competition, never fully committed but never brave enough to walk away, left the family group chat without explanation. She just disappeared digitally, her name simply gone from the participant list one morning. She stopped responding to relatives, stopped attending calls, stopped participating in any family communications. She was cutting herself off too in her own way, without the dramatic confrontation I had sparked, but with the same end result: freedom from the toxic system that had controlled our lives for so long. Meanwhile, my parents were caught in the middle of the family schism. My mother, who had been hesitant to take a side definitively, struggled to keep up with the damage my grandmother was causing with her manipulations. My father, who had quietly admitted his own regrets about the family dynamics, looked more exhausted than ever when I saw him in photos shared by relatives who still maintained connections with me. They had spent years avoiding conflict, trying to navigate the treacherous waters of my grandmother's favor without fully surrendering their autonomy. But the family wasn't letting them stay neutral anymore. The lines were being drawn more starkly than ever, and everyone was being forced to choose sides. Then my grandmother made her last power move, a public announcement meant to send a message to the entire family. She was changing her inheritance policy. From now on, only loyal family members would be included in her final will. The email was sent to everyone, even me, despite my ostracism. It was a direct shot at anyone who had stepped out of line, at anyone who had questioned her control or shown signs of independence. She was making it crystal clear: stay in the game or lose everything. I read the message twice, expecting some kind of reaction within myself. Maybe regret, maybe anger, maybe even a moment of doubt about my decision. But I felt nothing but a strange sense of relief. She thought this was her final move, her way of forcing people back in line through fear of disinheritance. But all I saw was someone who had spent her whole life pulling the strings, manipulating everyone around her, only to watch the whole thing start unraveling despite her best efforts to maintain control. I had spent years watching my family dance around her expectations, chasing her approval like it was oxygen they needed to survive. Now I had nothing to chase, no game to win, no ranking to climb. For the first time, I was truly free from the weight of expectations that had been placed on me since birth. News spread fast throughout the extended family. My grandmother had updated her will, and it sent a shockwave through the entire family network. At first, there were only whispers, small mentions of adjustments being made, of clarifications to inheritance plans. But it wasn't long before the real details leaked out. She had restructured everything, rewarding those who had stayed loyal and cutting out anyone who had questioned her control or shown signs of independence. It was the final step in solidifying her legacy, one last declaration of who had won and who had lost in her twisted game of family favorites. One Uncle Thomas, who had spent years playing the game and carefully positioning himself as a devoted family member, found himself completely written out of the will. He had dedicated his entire life to proving his worth, showing up to every family event no matter how minor, following every unspoken rule without question, molding his entire personality to fit what he thought my grandmother wanted. Now, with a single decision, it was all gone. He didn't take it well. At a small gathering at my grandmother's house, he apparently lost control completely. According to what I heard later, he was yelling, throwing accusations, demanding answers about why decades of loyalty had been discarded so easily. But my grandmother didn't flinch. She simply dismissed him with the same cold detachment she had shown me, treating his outburst as nothing more than an inconvenience. And just like that, another family member was erased from her inner circle. The cracks in the family structure turned into full breaks. Some relatives, exhausted from the endless game of proving themselves worthy, made a decision I understood all too well. They were done. No more playing along, no more trying to climb a ranking that didn't even guarantee them anything. They cut ties permanently, walking away from a system that had only brought bitterness and resentment into their lives. Then came my older brother Marcus's turn to face reality. After everything, years of competing, years of bending over backward to stay in my grandmother's good graces, years of carefully cultivating the perfect image of the devoted grandson, he found out he still wasn't the top choice. He had assumed he was the clear successor, the most loyal, the most deserving. But in the new will, my grandmother had given the biggest portion of her wealth to someone else, another relative who had outplayed him at the last moment. When I heard about it through the family grapevine, I expected to feel satisfaction or vindication. But all I felt was a hollow recognition of the inevitable. Marcus wasn't angry at my grandmother for her betrayal. He was angry at himself. Angry that after dedicating his life to impressing her, he still wasn't enough. That no matter how much he had sacrificed, he could still be pushed aside if someone else proved more useful or entertaining in her eyes. Then something happened that no one expected. One of my younger cousins, Zoe, someone who had always played along with the system, but had never been at the forefront of the competition, finally spoke up. During a small family gathering, in front of everyone assembled, she called out my grandmother's manipulation in terms no one had dared to use before. She laid it all out in plain language. How my grandmother had turned the family against itself. How she had pitted people against each other for her own amusement. How nothing was ever truly earned, but simply granted based on how well someone entertained her with their performance of success and loyalty. It was everything I had said months ago, but coming from someone who had always been in the fold, always been good, it carried a different weight. For the first time, no one defended my grandmother. The respect, the reverence, the way people had tiptoed around her influence, it all started to crumble in the face of this unexpected rebellion from within the ranks of the loyal family members. She had spent decades positioning herself as the head of a powerful, successful family. But now, as people started truly seeing the damage she had caused, all they saw was a woman who had orchestrated the destruction of her own bloodline for the sake of control. Even my father, who had been neutral for as long as possible, finally admitted that he regretted not leaving sooner. He could see it now, how the family had been built on control rather than love, on competition rather than support. He called me one evening, his voice carrying a weariness I'd never heard before. "I should have stood with you from the beginning," he said quietly. "I was too afraid of losing everything we'd built to see what we were actually losing by staying." But my mother still clung to the old ways, even as everything was falling apart around her. She refused to believe that the system she had followed for so long was fundamentally broken. In her calls, she still spoke of reconciliation, of finding a way back into my grandmother's good graces, as if that was still the ultimate goal everyone should be striving for. Then the consequences started hitting the family financially in ways that couldn't be ignored. One of the family businesses, deeply tied to my grandmother's wealth and influence, began to suffer visibly. The relatives who ran it had always been united under her rule, working together despite personal differences because they feared her disapproval. But now, they refused to collaborate, their facades of cooperation crumbling as long-simmering resentments came to the surface. Grudges that had been buried for years emerged with a vengeance. Business meetings turned into shouting matches. Deals fell apart because partners couldn't agree on basic terms. The carefully constructed image of a successful family enterprise started cracking from within as the framework of fear and obligation that had held it together disintegrated. And then came the biggest betrayal, one that shocked even me when I heard about it. One of my grandmother's most trusted family members, my cousin Victoria, one of her top players who had always been rewarded handsomely for her loyalty, turned against her openly. After years of doing everything right, following every rule to the letter, she refused to comply with the new inheritance conditions. She refused to sign the loyalty agreement my grandmother had drawn up, a document apparently designed to formalize the unspoken rules of the family competition. And just like that, my grandmother lost control over another key piece in her carefully built empire. Victoria had been groomed to take over significant family holdings, had been positioned as an example of what loyalty could earn you. Her defection wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a visible crack in the system itself. From the outside, I watched it all unfold like a spectator at a play whose ending I could predict but couldn't change. A few distant relatives reached out, asking for my thoughts, wondering if I had anything to say now that the whole thing was falling apart. But I wasn't interested in being dragged back in, even as a commentator on the sidelines. I had built a new life for myself, one based on genuine connections rather than transactions disguised as relationships. Then my grandmother made her last move. She reached out again. One final call. Her voice was even, measured, betraying none of the desperation that must have been driving her to contact me after everything that had happened. She said there was still time to fix things, that if I apologized, if I made an effort to restore balance within the family, things could be different. It wasn't about making peace. It was about control. She had lost her grip on the family she had manipulated for decades, and she was looking for someone to bring it back together, someone she could still influence. The irony that she was turning to the person who had first challenged her system wasn't lost on me. I told her the truth without hesitation or sugarcoating. She had destroyed the family, not me, not the ones who had walked away. Her. Her need for control, her manipulation, her pitting family members against each other. That was what had torn us apart. I told her I would never be part of her system again, no matter what she offered. Then I hung up, ending the conversation on my terms. A few days later, a cousin who had once turned against me, who had been among the first to cut ties when I challenged the family system, reached out unexpectedly. Their message was simple, but seemed genuine. They were sorry. They had believed the stories about me at first, had gone along with the narrative because it was easier, because it was safer than questioning the status quo. But now they saw the truth, and they wanted me to know they regretted their role in ostracizing me. Some of the family members went completely no contact with everyone, not just my grandmother. Others, desperate to hold on to something of the past, still tried to keep the competition alive, arranging small gatherings where they could showcase their achievements and seek validation from each other. It was as if pretending the system wasn't over would somehow bring it back, restore the certainty it had provided despite its toxicity. But for me, it was over. I had escaped the gravity of my grandmother's influence, built a life outside the twisted value system I had grown up with. And for the first time, I wasn't looking back with regret or doubt. I was looking forward to a future defined by my own choices rather than someone else's judgment. The true aftermath unfolded over the following months. News spread fast through what remained of the family network. My grandmother had updated her will again, and it sent another shockwave through the already fractured family. At first, there were only whispers, as usual, but the details emerged quickly this time, as the remaining loyalists scrambled to understand their positions in the new order. She had restructured everything once more, this time even more drastically than before. The rewards for those who had stayed loyal were increased, while anyone who had shown even a hint of independence was cut out completely. It was her final declaration of who had won and who had lost in her eyes. Uncle Thomas, who had already faced one devastating exclusion, found himself not only removed from the will, but also from the family business he had helped build for over 30 years. His position, his office, his role in the company, all given to someone else with a simple directive from my grandmother. He had dedicated his entire life to proving his worth, and with a single decision, it was all erased. This time, he didn't just lose control emotionally. According to what I heard later, he had a complete breakdown. At a board meeting, he shouted accusations, demanded explanations, threw papers across the conference table. But my grandmother remained unmoved, simply having him escorted from the building by security, treating his decades of service as if they meant nothing. The cracks in the foundation had become chasms. More relatives made the decision I had made months earlier. They were done with the game entirely. No more pretending, no more competing, no more sacrificing their authentic selves for conditional acceptance. They cut ties completely, walking away from not just potential inheritance, but from the entire family structure. Then came my brother Marcus's final humiliation. After everything, the years of competition, the public endorsement from our grandmother, the business investment that had gone so badly wrong, he discovered that he had been completely written out of the will. Not just demoted from his position as presumed heir apparent, but removed entirely. He wasn't just angry at my grandmother. He was destroyed by the realization that after dedicating his life to impressing her, after sacrificing his own dreams and authentic self to become what she wanted, he still wasn't enough. That no matter how much he had given up, he could still be discarded if someone else proved more useful or entertaining in her eyes. His entire identity had been built around being the favored grandson, and now that foundation was gone. Then something happened that truly no one expected. My younger cousin Zoe, who had already shocked everyone by speaking out against my grandmother, took an even bolder step. During a family gathering that had been arranged to discuss reconciliation, which everyone knew was code for getting back in line, she stood up in front of everyone and formally announced her complete separation from the family. She wasn't just stepping back, she was cutting ties entirely. She laid out exactly why. How my grandmother had turned the family against itself, how she had pitted people against each other for her own amusement, how nothing was ever truly earned, but simply granted based on how well someone performed. It was everything I had said months ago, but coming from someone who had always been in the fold, always been good, it carried a different weight. This time, not only did no one defend my grandmother, but several others spoke up in agreement. The respect, the reverence, the way people had tiptoed around her influence, it all crumbled in the face of this unexpected rebellion from within the ranks of the loyal family members. Even my father, who had been neutral for as long as possible, finally admitted openly in front of others that he regretted not leaving sooner. He could see it now, he said, how the family had been built on control, not love. My mother, however, still clung to the old ways. Even as everything was falling apart, she refused to believe that the system she had followed for so long was fundamentally broken. Then the consequences started hitting financially in ways that couldn't be ignored. One of the family businesses, a real estate development company that had been the flagship of our family's wealth for generations, began to suffer visibly. The relatives who ran it had always been united under my grandmother's rule, working together despite personal differences because they feared her disapproval more than they disliked each other. But now, with her influence waning and the fear fading, they refused to work together. Grudges that had been buried for years surfaced. Deals fell apart. Projects stalled. And the structure that had seemed untouchable started cracking under the weight of decades of suppressed conflicts and resentments. And then came the biggest betrayal, one that shocked even me when I heard about it. My cousin Victoria, one of my grandmother's most trusted family members, one of her top players, turned against her openly. After years of doing everything right, following every rule to the letter, she refused to comply with new demands my grandmother had made of her. She refused to sign over partial ownership of the business she had built, even though it had been funded with family money. And just like that, my grandmother lost control over another key piece in her carefully built empire. Victoria had been groomed to take over significant family holdings, had been positioned as an example of what loyalty could earn you. Her defection wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a visible crack in the system itself. From the outside, I watched it all unfold like a spectator at a play whose ending I could predict but couldn't change. A few distant relatives reached out, asking for my thoughts, wondering if I had anything to say now that the whole thing was falling apart. But I wasn't interested in being dragged back in, even as a commentator on the sidelines. Then my grandmother made her last move. She reached out again. One final call. Her voice was even, measured, betraying none of the desperation that must have been driving her to contact me after everything that had happened. She said there was still time to fix things, that if I apologized, if I made an effort to restore balance within the family, things could be different. It wasn't about making peace. It was about control. She had lost her grip on the family she had manipulated for decades, and she was looking for someone to bring it back together. Someone she could still manipulate. The irony wasn't lost on me that she was turning to the very person who had first challenged her system. I told her the truth. She had destroyed the family, not me, not the ones who had walked away. Her need for control, her manipulation, her pitting family members against each other. That was what had torn us apart. I told her I would never be part of her system again, no matter what she offered. Then I hung up, ending the conversation on my terms. A few days later, a cousin who had once turned against me, who had been among the first to cut ties when I challenged the family system, reached out unexpectedly. Their message was simple but seemed genuine. They were sorry. They had believed the stories about me at first, had gone along with the narrative because it was easier, because it was safer than questioning the status quo. But now, they saw the truth. And they wanted me to know they regretted their role in ostracizing me. Some of the family members went completely no contact with everyone, not just my grandmother. Others, desperate to hold on to something, still tried to keep the competition alive, as if pretending it wasn't over would somehow bring it back. But for me, it was over. I had escaped, and for the first time I wasn't looking back. News spread fast through the family network. My grandmother had made another dramatic change to her will, and it sent another shockwave through the already fractured family. This time, she had completely rewritten everything, disinheriting even longtime loyalists who had shown the slightest hesitation or questioned any of her recent decisions. It was the desperate move of someone whose power was slipping away, a last attempt to enforce compliance through fear. But instead of bringing people back in line, it only pushed more away. The tipping point had been reached. The fear of being cut off no longer outweighed the desire for freedom from manipulation. The family business suffered another major setback when 3 key members resigned on the same day, unwilling to continue under the toxic conditions that had developed. The carefully built empire that had been the source of so much pride and the tool of so much control was crumbling visibly, its foundation revealed to be built on fear rather than solid business principles. My brother Marcus, once the golden child and presumed heir, was now struggling not just emotionally, but financially. The business venture that my grandmother had funded so publicly was now failing completely, leaving him with massive debt and a tarnished reputation in the industry. He had built his entire identity around being the successful grandson, and now that was gone. Through an intermediary, an uncle who had maintained contact with both sides, I heard that Marcus was blaming me for everything. In his mind, I had started this chain reaction that led to his downfall. He couldn't see that the system had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning, that it would have eventually collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, regardless of my actions. Then came a moment that truly marked the end of an era. At what would turn out to be the last family gathering my grandmother would ever host, attendance was sparse. Less than half the family showed up, a stark contrast to the full house events that had once been mandatory for anyone wanting to stay in her good graces. Those who did attend reported an atmosphere of tension and awkwardness, with conversations staying firmly in safe territory and everyone avoiding the obvious topic of the family's disintegration. My grandmother sat at the head of the half-empty table, maintaining her composure but unable to hide the reality of what had happened to her once tight control over the family. The carefully constructed hierarchy she had maintained for decades had collapsed, and no amount of financial threats or emotional manipulation could rebuild it. A week after that last gathering, I received an unexpected email from a family lawyer. My grandmother was selling properties, significant ones that had been in our family for generations. The mansion where we had held those reunion competitions, the vacation homes that had been dangled as rewards, the investment properties that had funded so many of the gifts to favored family members, all being liquidated. Some speculated that she was facing financial problems due to the family businesses faltering without the forced cooperation she had once maintained. Others thought she was simplifying her estate to avoid the complications that would inevitably arise when she eventually passed. But I saw it for what it was. She was removing the bait from the hook. If she couldn't control the family through promises of inheritance, she would ensure no one got what they had been competing for all these years. It was her final act of control. If she couldn't have the family dancing to her tune, she would make sure they had nothing to dance for at all. The properties that had been promised to various family members, the investments that had been earmarked for future generations, all of it was being converted to liquid assets that could be more easily controlled and redirected. The reaction was predictable. Those who had stayed loyal despite everything, hoping their patience would eventually be rewarded with a significant inheritance, were devastated. Years of playing the game, of sacrificing their authenticity and independence, all for nothing. The few who had been named in previous versions of the will and who still believed they were in favor reached out to her in panic, but their calls went unanswered. My father called me again, his voice heavy with a mix of regret and relief. "It's really over now," he said. "The whole system she built, the competition, the ranking, none of it matters anymore." He seemed lighter somehow, despite the financial implications. The burden of pretending, of constantly measuring up to an impossible standard, had been lifted from his shoulders. My mother, who had clung to the old ways longer than most, finally began to see the reality of what had happened. She called me one evening, her voice lacking the defensive edge it had carried for months. "I should have listened to you sooner," she admitted quietly. "I spent so many years thinking this was just how families worked, that there was always a price for belonging. I didn't want to believe we'd been manipulated all this time." Even Marcus, who had been my most vocal critic and most dedicated competitor for our grandmother's favor, seemed to be coming to terms with the truth. Through a mutual cousin, I heard that he had started therapy, trying to untangle his sense of self-worth from the external validation he had chased for so long. He wasn't ready to reach out to me directly, but the white-hot anger he had directed my way had cooled to something more reflective. As for me, I watched the final dissolution of the family system with a strange mix of sadness and vindication. I hadn't wanted to be right about how toxic it all was. I had simply wanted to be free of it. But seeing others finding their own paths to freedom, even if it came through pain and disillusionment, gave me hope that something healthier might eventually grow from the ashes of what our family had been. A month later, a small group of family members, those who had been the first to see the system for what it was and walk away, arranged a gathering of their own. It wasn't at my grandmother's mansion, but at a rented beach house, nothing fancy but comfortable and welcoming. There were no performances of success, no subtle competitions for approval, just people reconnecting as equals, trying to rebuild relationships that had been warped by years of artificial hierarchy. I went somewhat hesitantly at first, but found myself relaxing as the day progressed. We talked about the past openly, the manipulation we had experienced, the ways we had been pitted against each other, the price we had all paid for belonging to a system that valued obedience over authenticity. But we also talked about the future, about building connections based on genuine care rather than strategic advantage. My younger cousin Zoe, who had been so bold in her rejection of the family system, sat next to me as the sun was setting over the ocean. "Do you think we'll ever be a real family?" she asked, her eyes on the horizon. I didn't have an easy answer for her. The damage done over decades couldn't be undone in a day or a year, maybe not even in a lifetime. Some relationships were probably broken beyond repair. But watching the people around us, talking, laughing, being present with each other without an agenda, I felt a cautious optimism. "I think we're already starting to be," I told her. "This is what families should look like. People who choose to be together. Not because they're afraid of being cut off or hoping for a reward, but because they genuinely want to be in each other's lives." She nodded, seeming satisfied with that answer. And as we sat there watching the waves, I realized that while my grandmother had lost her empire of control, those of us who had walked away had gained something far more valuable: the chance to build authentic connections without the poison of competition and conditional acceptance. The family would never be what it once was. The grand reunions at the mansion, the appearance of perfect success and harmony, the structure and hierarchy that had defined us for so long. But maybe it could become something better. Smaller, perhaps, less impressive from the outside, but real in a way it had never been before. As for my grandmother, she remained isolated in her diminishing kingdom, surrounded by fewer and fewer loyal subjects as the months passed. The empire she had built through manipulation and conditional love was crumbling around her. But even as everything she had worked for slipped away, she refused to acknowledge her role in its destruction. In her mind, we were still the ones who had failed to appreciate her guidance, failed to recognize her wisdom, failed to be worthy of her favor. She couldn't see that by trying to control everyone and everything, she had ultimately lost it all. I sometimes wonder if she ever has moments of clarity, if she ever looks at the half-empty rooms of her mansion and questions whether it was all worth it. Did turning family relationships into competitions for her approval bring her the satisfaction she sought? Or did she, in her quieter moments, regret the genuine connections she sacrificed at the altar of control? I'll probably never know. Some cycles of toxic behavior are too deeply entrenched to be broken. Some worldviews too rigid to be reshaped by reality. But for the rest of us, there was still hope for something better. Not a perfect family by any means, but one built on honesty and acceptance rather than manipulation and fear. The last I heard, my grandmother was still making changes to her will, still trying to use what power she had left to influence those few family members who remained in contact with her. The game continued for her, even as fewer and fewer people were willing to play. But I was no longer watching from the sidelines or worrying about the outcome. I had walked away from the game entirely, and in doing so, I had found a freedom I never knew was possible. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments when I missed the family I thought I had, when I wondered what might have been if things had been different. But those moments grew fewer and less painful as time passed, and my new life, built on my own terms, continued to take shape. In the end, standing up to my grandmother's system cost me a certain kind of family, one defined by hierarchy, competition, and conditional acceptance. But it gave me the chance to discover what family could be when stripped of those toxic elements. A group of people who choose each other, support each other, and value each other for who they truly are, not for what they can provide or how well they perform. And that, I've come to believe, is worth far more than any inheritance could ever be.